Alright, let's be real for a second. Jimmy Fallon is one of the most charismatic late-night hosts in American television history, and when BTS walks into Studio 6B at Rockefeller Center, something magical and sometimes dangerously unscripted happens. See, here's the thing about live TV. There's no edit button. No second take. No manager whispering, "Don't answer that into an earpiece fast enough." And Jimmy? Jimmy has this almost supernatural ability to make his guests feel so comfortable, so relaxed, that their walls come crashing down before they even realize what just happened. Now imagine that energy colliding with 7 guys from South Korea who've been trained to be careful with every word, but who also happen to be some of the most genuine, unfiltered humans in the entertainment industry. What happens when Jimmy's playful curiosity meets BTS's unguarded honesty? What secret did one member accidentally confirm that had fans losing their minds on Twitter within seconds? Which member's hidden habit got exposed through a simple party game that was supposed to be just fun and laughs? And here's the real question, was there a moment so revealing that even the other members couldn't believe what just slipped out on national television? Buckle up, because this isn't your typical interview recap. This is a countdown of 7 moments where Jimmy Fallon, whether he knew it or not, became the ultimate BTS secret revealer, and some of these moments changed the way fans saw their bias forever. Let's get into it. Number 7. Jin. The secret emotional eater that Jimmy exposed without even trying. Now, if you know anything about Kim Seokjin, the man the world lovingly calls worldwide handsome, you probably think you've got him figured out. He's the eldest member of BTS, the guy who walks into any room and immediately owns it with a dad joke, so painfully unfunny that it somehow becomes the funniest thing you've ever heard. He's confident, theatrical, always performing even when the cameras aren't rolling. That's the Jin the public knows. That's the Jin that big hit, now HYBE, carefully curated over years of content, interviews, and variety show appearances. But what happened on The Tonight Show during one of BTS's most iconic visits? Jimmy Fallon, with nothing more than a casual, seemingly harmless question during a game segment, accidentally peeled back a layer of Jin that even longtime armies hadn't fully grasped before. And the wildest part? Jimmy had absolutely no idea what he'd just done. He just kept laughing, moving on to the next question, completely unaware that he'd just set the entire BTS fandom on fire. Let's rewind and break this down properly, because the context here is everything. It was during one of those classic Tonight Show game segments, the kind Jimmy is famous for, where the energy is loose, the stakes feel low, and guests let their guard down because it feels more like hanging out with a friend than sitting under studio lights in front of millions of viewers. Jimmy had set up this rapid-fire question round, and the whole thing was designed to be light, fun, and entertaining. Nothing deep. Nothing probing. Just vibes. And that's exactly why it worked so well as a trap, because it wasn't a trap at all. Jimmy turned to Jin at one point and asked something along the lines of what Jin does when he's stressed or overwhelmed after a long schedule. Simple question, right? The kind of thing any host would ask. But here's where it gets interesting. Instead of giving the polished, media-trained answer that most K-pop idols are conditioned to deliver, something like, "I listen to music," or "I spend time with the members," Jin, in his completely disarming, unfiltered way, just casually admitted that he eats. Not just snacking. Not just grabbing a bite. Jin described, with this very specific and almost vulnerable honesty, how food becomes his entire emotional reset button. He talked about how after particularly exhausting days, the kind where the choreography rehearsals run past midnight, where the vocal recordings drain every ounce of energy, where the pressure of being BTS feels like carrying a mountain on your shoulders. He doesn't meditate, he doesn't journal, he doesn't call a friend. He cooks. He goes to his kitchen, sometimes at 2 or 3 in the morning, and he makes himself a full meal. And not just ramen or something quick. We're talking proper dishes, the kind his mom taught him, the kind that require attention, patience, and care. And then he sits alone and eats, slowly, savoring every bite, and that's how he processes everything. Now, on the surface, this might sound like a cute, relatable celebrity moment. Oh, Jin likes to eat, how adorable. And yeah, Jimmy played it that way. He laughed, made a joke about wanting to come over for dinner, and the audience chuckled. Classic Fallon energy. But ARMYs? ARMYs caught something much deeper in that moment. Because what Jin had just revealed, perhaps without fully realizing it, was that behind the worldwide handsome bravado, behind the confidence and the jokes and the theatrical persona, there's a man who processes his emotions in solitude. Through cooking. Through the quiet, repetitive, almost meditative act of preparing food for himself when the rest of the world is asleep. That's not just a fun fact about a celebrity's eating habits. That's a window into someone's coping mechanism. And the reason this hit so hard within the fandom is because it connected dots that fans had been noticing for years. Jin's Eat Jean series on VLive, where he would sit and eat meals on camera, had always been seen as entertainment, just Jin being Jin, mukbang style. But after this Tonight Show moment, fans started rewatching those old Eat Jean episodes with completely different eyes. The way he'd sometimes go quiet between bites. The way he'd stare off into the distance for just a second before snapping back with a joke. The way he always seemed most at peace, most genuinely himself, when he was sitting in front of a meal. It wasn't just content. It was therapy. It was his way of centering himself in an industry that never stopped spinning. And Jimmy Fallon, bless his heart, had no clue he'd just unlocked this entire emotional revelation. He was already moving on to Jungkook, already setting up the next joke, completely oblivious to the fact that Twitter was exploding in real time with threads analyzing Jin's answer frame by frame. The hashtags started trending within minutes. Think pieces were written. Fan artists created illustrations of Jin cooking alone in a quiet kitchen at 3 a.m., and those illustrations went viral because they captured something that felt painfully real. What makes this moment so significant in the larger context of BTS's relationship with Western media is that it highlights something Jimmy Fallon does better than almost any other late-night host. He creates an environment where people forget they're on television. Jin didn't give that answer because he was prompted by a publicist. He gave it because Jimmy made it feel safe to be honest. And in doing so, he gave fans a piece of himself that years of carefully produced BTS content had only hinted at. The eldest member, the protector, the one who always puts on a brave face and makes everyone laugh. He goes home and cooks for himself in the silence of the early morning, and that's where he finds his peace. If that doesn't make you see Jin differently, I don't know what will. But hold on, if you think Jimmy accidentally revealing Jin's emotional coping mechanism was intense, wait until you hear what happened with the next member on this list, because Jimmy didn't just reveal a habit. He accidentally confirmed something that the fandom had been debating for years. Number 6. Suga. The midnight composer whose secret studio ritual Jimmy blew wide open. Min Youngie. The man who raps like he's got fire in his lungs and produces music like he was born with a mixing board fused into his DNA. If BTS were a kingdom, Suga would be the shadow strategist, the one who doesn't say much, doesn't seek the spotlight, but quietly pulls the strings that make everything work. He's the member who once said he could live inside a studio for the rest of his life and be perfectly happy. The member who, under his alter ego Auguste, released some of the most raw, confrontational, emotionally devastating solo music in the entire K-pop landscape. Fans know him as savage, unbothered, the king of I don't care energy. But Jimmy Fallon, in one of those beautiful, chaotic, completely unscripted Tonight Show moments, accidentally cracked open a door into Youngie's creative world that even the most dedicated ARMYs had never fully seen. And the way it happened? Almost absurdly casual. The kind of moment you'd miss if you blinked. But if you were paying attention, really paying attention, it changed everything you thought you knew about how Min Youngie makes music. Here's the setup. BTS was on The Tonight Show for one of their landmark appearances, the kind that broke viewership records and trended worldwide before the segment even finished airing. The energy in Studio 6B was electric. The members were relaxed, riding the high of performing, laughing with Jimmy, feeding off the audience's energy. And Jimmy, being Jimmy, started doing his thing, weaving between structured questions and spontaneous tangents, creating that signature Fallon atmosphere where the line between interview and friendship completely dissolves. At some point during the conversation, Jimmy started talking about creative process. He mentioned how some musicians write best in the morning, some late at night, some need total silence, some need chaos. It was a general observation, not directed at anyone specific. But then he turned to Youngie, almost as an afterthought, like he was just making casual conversation, and said something like, "I heard you actually send voice memos to yourself in the middle of the night with melody ideas? Like, you'll wake up from a dead sleep and just start humming into your phone. Now, pause. Rewind. Process that for a second." Because what Jimmy had just done, probably without even realizing the weight of it, was publicly confirm something that had existed only as whispered fan theory and vague hints in behind-the-scenes content. See, ARMYs had long suspected that Youngie's creative process wasn't just about sitting in his genius lab studio grinding away at a computer for hours. There had been breadcrumbs scattered across years of content, moments in Bangtan Bombs where Youngie would be caught mumbling melodies under his breath during flights, instances in Run BTS episodes where members would joke about Youngie's phone being full of random audio recordings, brief mentions in interviews where he'd allude to ideas coming to him at strange hours. But it had never been explicitly laid out like this. Not on national American television. Not in front of millions of viewers worldwide. And Youngie's reaction? That's where the real gold was. Because instead of deflecting, instead of laughing it off with his signature deadpan, "I don't know what you're talking about," energy, Youngie actually leaned into it. Maybe it was the atmosphere Jimmy had created. Maybe it was because the question felt so casual that it didn't trigger his usual media-trained defenses. Whatever the reason, Youngie started explaining, in his characteristically low, measured voice, how some of his most important musical ideas have come to him not in the studio, not during scheduled writing sessions, but in the space between sleep and consciousness. That liminal zone where your brain is half dreaming and half awake. He described how he keeps his phone on his pillow specifically for this reason. How he's trained himself to reach for it instinctively when a melody surfaces from somewhere deep in his subconscious, to hum it into a voice memo before it evaporates like morning fog. He even mentioned that some of the melodic foundations for songs that ended up on BTS's biggest albums were talking tracks that charted globally, that were performed in sold-out stadiums, started as groggy, half-asleep voice recordings made at 3 or 4 in the morning in a dark hotel room somewhere on tour. Let that sink in. Some of the melodies that soundtracked millions of people's most important life moments, their heartbreaks, their healing, their moments of triumph, were born from Min Youngie mumbling into his phone while barely conscious. That's not just a fun behind-the-scenes fact. That's a revelation about the nature of artistic genius itself. And the fandom absolutely erupted. Within hours of the episode airing, ARMYs were going back through BTS's entire discography, trying to figure out which songs might have originated as 3 a.m. voice memos. Production analysis threads exploded across social media. Music theory fans started breaking down the melodic structures of tracks like Spring Day, The Last, and various August decompositions, looking for evidence of that raw, unpolished, dream state quality that Youngie had described. Some fans even pointed out that certain BTS songs have these hauntingly simple melodic cores beneath layers of complex production, and argued that this was evidence of their voice memo origins. A melody pure enough to be hummed half asleep, then built into a full arrangement in the studio later. What made this moment particularly powerful was what it revealed about the gap between Suga's public persona and his private creative reality. The Suga that fans see as controlled, precise, almost clinical in his perfectionism. He's the producer who reportedly spends weeks fine-tuning a single snare sound. He's the rapper who rewrites verses dozens of times until every syllable hits exactly right. That's the Suga of the studio, the craftsman. But the Youngie that Jimmy accidentally introduced to the world that night was something entirely different. A man so consumed by music that it literally follows him into his dreams. Someone who can't turn it off even when he's unconscious. Someone for whom creativity isn't a job or even a passion, but a fundamental biological function, as involuntary as breathing. And there's something deeply moving about that image, Youngie alone in a dark room, half asleep, desperately trying to capture a melody before it disappears. not knowing whether that mumbled recording will become nothing or become something that millions of people will one day sing back to him in a stadium. Jimmy, of course, responded with his typical warmth and humor, joking about how he also sends himself voice memos, but they're usually just reminders to buy milk. The audience laughed. The moment passed. But for ARMYs, nothing was the same. Every time they listened to a BTS song after that, every time a melody hit them in a way they couldn't quite explain, they'd wonder, was this the one? Was this the 3 a.m. voice memo? Was this the melody that found Youngie in his sleep and refused to let go until he pressed record? That's the kind of secret you can't put back in the box once it's out. And Jimmy Fallon opened that box on live television without even knowing he was holding it. Now, you might think accidentally exposing a member's most intimate creative ritual is as deep as this list gets, but the next entry takes things to a completely different territory. Because what Jimmy uncovered about the next member wasn't just a secret habit, it was a hidden emotional truth that nobody, not even the other members sitting right there on that couch, saw coming. Number 5. J-Hope. The sunshine facade that Jimmy accidentally shattered with one innocent question. Young Hoseok. J-Hope. BTS's eternal sun. The human embodiment of serotonin. The member who walks into a room and somehow makes the air itself feel lighter, warmer, more alive. For over a decade, J-Hope has been the emotional engine of BTS, the one who screams ARMY with enough energy to power a small city, the one who dances like gravity is just a suggestion he's politely declining, the one whose smile has been scientifically weaponized to cure bad moods across every continent on this planet. That's the J-Hope the world knows. That's the J-Hope that trends on social media with clips of him hyping up stadiums, goofing around backstage, turning every mundane moment into a celebration of being alive. But what if that relentless, unstoppable sunshine wasn't as effortless as it looked? What if maintaining that energy, that expectation, that identity came with a cost that Hoseok had been quietly carrying for years without anyone truly understanding the weight of it? Jimmy Fallon, during what should have been a completely lighthearted segment, asked one seemingly innocent question that ripped the curtain wide open. And the silence that followed, those 3 or 4 seconds of absolute quiet before Hoseok answered, told a story that no amount of curated content ever could. Let's set the scene properly, because the atmosphere matters here. BTS was deep into one of their Tonight Show appearances, and the vibe was exactly what you'd expect. Chaotic, joyful, 7 guys and a host feeding off each other's energy like they'd been friends for years. Jimmy had been bouncing between members, asking fun questions, playing games, keeping things moving at that signature Fallon pace where everything feels spontaneous even when there's a loose structure underneath. The audience was loud. The members were laughing. Everything was running on pure adrenaline and good vibes. And then Jimmy pivoted to Hoseok. Nothing unusual about that. He'd been going around the group. But instead of asking about music or dance or something performance-related, Jimmy, in that casually curious way only he can pull off, asked Hoseok something along the lines of whether it ever gets exhausting being the happy one. Whether there are days when he doesn't feel like smiling, but knows everyone expects him to. It was phrased gently, almost playfully, the way Jimmy phrases everything. There was no weight behind it from Jimmy's perspective. It was just conversation. Just a host being genuinely curious about the human being sitting across from him. But the moment those words left Jimmy's mouth, something shifted in the room. Not dramatically. Not in a way that would make a highlight reel. But if you were watching closely, if you were an ARMY who had spent years studying every micro-expression on young Hoseok's face, you saw it. That split-second flicker. That tiny fracture in the sunshine. Hoseok's smile didn't disappear, but it changed. It went from performative to real, and real smiles from Hoseok are actually quieter, softer, tinged with something that looks almost like relief. Like someone finally asked the question he'd been waiting to be asked, but never wanted to bring up himself. And then he answered. Not with a joke. Not with his signature, "I'm your hope, you're my hope" deflection. He answered honestly. Hoseok admitted, right there on American national television, that there are absolutely days, more than people would think, where the J-Hope energy doesn't come naturally. Days where he wakes up tired, emotionally drained, maybe even sad, and he has to actively construct the version of himself that the world expects to see. He described it not as fakeness. He was very careful about that distinction, but as a conscious choice. A discipline. He said something to the effect of choosing to be the sun because he knows the members need it, because he knows ARMY needs it, and because somewhere along the way, the act of choosing happiness even when he doesn't feel it became its own form of sincerity. He talked about how in the early days of BTS, when they were trainees sharing cramped dorm rooms, eating cheap meals, wondering if they'd ever make it, he realized that someone in the group had to be the emotional anchor. Someone had to be the one who laughed first in the morning, who cracked jokes during grueling practice sessions, who kept the mood from sinking when exhaustion and doubt crept in. And he chose to be that person. Not because it was easy, but because he understood, even as a teenager, that energy is contagious, and if he could generate enough light, it would spread to the others. That's not just being cheerful. That's emotional labor on a level most people can't even comprehend. It's showing up every single day, in front of cameras and crowds and millions of eyes, and performing not just choreography, but an entire emotional identity. And Hoseok had been doing it for over a decade, without ever really talking about what it costs him. Jimmy, to his enormous credit, didn't brush past the moment. He paused. He nodded. He said something genuinely kind about how that takes real strength. But even Jimmy didn't fully grasp the earthquake he'd just triggered in the fandom. Because armies were already connecting dots at light speed. Every moment of Hoseok looking quietly contemplative in behind-the-scenes footage, the moments fans had previously dismissed as, oh, he's just tired, suddenly took on a completely different meaning. His solo work started being re-examined through this lens. Blue Side, that hauntingly melancholic hidden track from his Hope World mixtape, wasn't just an artistic choice, it was a confession. The very title was a contradiction of everything J-Hope was supposed to represent. Blue. Not sunny. Not golden. Blue. And Arson from Jack in the Box, where he literally rapped about burning out, about the fire consuming the person feeding it. Fans had analyzed those lyrics before, but after this Tonight Show moment, they hit different. They hit like truth that had been hiding in plain sight, wrapped in metaphor, waiting for someone like Jimmy Fallon to accidentally hand the world the decoder ring. The reaction online was unlike anything a simple interview moment usually generates. It wasn't just trending hashtags and viral clips. It was armies writing long, deeply personal threads about their own experiences with performing happiness for others. It was people sharing how Hoseok's admission made them feel seen, because how many of us are the J-Hope of our friend groups, our families, our workplaces? How many of us have chosen to be the sun for everyone else while quietly wondering who's going to be the sun for us? That's what Jimmy unlocked. Not just a celebrity secret. A universal human truth delivered through the specific, particular, heartbreakingly beautiful lens of young Hoseok's lived experience. And the most devastating part? After that moment of raw honesty, after letting the mask slip for just a few seconds on live television, Hoseok did exactly what Hoseok always does. He smiled, a real one this time, clapped his hands together, made a joke, and brought the energy right back up. Because that's who he is. Not because he's performing, but because even his vulnerability is an act of love. He let the world see his truth, and then he immediately went back to making sure everyone else felt okay. If that doesn't wreck you emotionally, I genuinely don't know what will. But don't even think about catching your breath yet, because the next member on this list? What Jimmy accidentally pulled out of them wasn't just emotionally revealing, it was the kind of confession that made the entire studio audience gasp in real time. And the clip still circulates as one of the most replayed BTS interview moments in history. Number 4. Jungkook. The golden magne's hidden obsession that Jimmy dragged into the spotlight. Jungkook. The youngest. The golden magne. The member who can sing like an angel, dance like he invented movement, rap when he feels like it, draw, compose, direct films, box, do archery, cook, and probably solve advanced calculus if you gave him 30 minutes and a competitive enough reason to try. Since the age of 15, this kid from Busan has been in front of cameras, performing on stages, living a life that most adults couldn't handle. And doing it all with a level of natural talent that honestly feels unfair to every other human being who's ever tried to be good at anything. That's the Jungkook narrative, right? The prodigy. The guy who picks up skills the way normal people pick up groceries. Easy. Effortless. Almost annoyingly natural. But here's the thing about narratives, they're constructed. They're curated. They show you the highlight reel and let you fill in the gaps with assumptions. And the assumption most people made about Jungkook's extraordinary range of abilities was that he was simply gifted. Born with it. Lucky DNA. End of story. But Jimmy Fallon, during one of those beautifully unstructured Tonight Show conversations, accidentally detonated that assumption into a million pieces. And what emerged from the rubble was a truth about Jungkook that was simultaneously more impressive and more heartbreaking than any Golden Magne highlight compilation could ever capture. Here's how it went down. The members were deep into a segment, one of those classic Fallon setups where competition is involved, because Jimmy knows that nothing makes better television than watching talented people try to one-up each other. There was a game, something involving physical skill or quick reflexes, the exact kind of activity where Jungkook typically dominates without breaking a sweat. And sure enough, Jungkook won. Convincingly. The audience cheered, the members playfully groaned, and Jimmy, riding the energy of the moment, made an offhand comment. Something along the lines of asking whether Jungkook just naturally wins at everything or whether there's some secret behind it. It was meant as a compliment. A throwaway remark. The kind of thing you say to someone who's obviously talented. But and this is crucial, because this is where the real revelation came from. Glanced at Jungkook with this knowing look, and then said something to Jimmy that changed the entire temperature of the conversation. Namjoon, translating and elaborating in that articulate way of his, casually mentioned that Jungkook doesn't just do things well naturally. He told Jimmy that Jungkook actually practices things in secret. Obsessively. That if Jungkook loses at something, anything, even the most trivial game during a Bangtan bomb filming, he will go away, privately practice that exact thing over and over and over again, and come back weeks later to challenge whoever beat him. Not for the cameras. Not for content. Just for himself. Because he literally cannot accept being second at anything. Jimmy laughed, because of course he did on the surface. It sounds like a funny competitive quirk. Oh, the youngest member is a sore loser, how cute. But then Jungkook himself, in a moment of openness that felt almost reluctant, like he hadn't planned on this becoming a whole thing, started filling in the details. And that's when cute competitive streak transformed into something that fans would spend weeks dissecting. Jungkook described, in his characteristically understated way, how he would watch YouTube tutorials at 3 in the morning to learn skills that other members had casually shown him up in. How he once spent an entire week secretly practicing a specific bowling technique after Suga offhandedly beat him during a group outing. How when he first joined BTS as a trainee and realized that every other member was older, more experienced, more polished in at least one area, he made a private pact with himself that he would eventually become proficient, not just good, proficient, at every single skill the other 6 members individually excelled at. Singing like Jin and Jimin. Rapping like Namjoon, Youngie, and Hoseok. Dancing like Hoseok and Jimin. Writing and producing like Namjoon and Youngie. Not because anyone asked him to. Not because the company demanded it. But because 15-year-old Jungkook, brand new to Seoul, terrified of being the youngest and the least experienced, decided that the only way to justify his place in this group was to become everything. All at once. Better than everyone. At everything. And the room went quiet for a moment. Not awkward quiet, reverent quiet. Because what Jungkook had just described wasn't a fun personality trait. It was a coping mechanism born from deep, fundamental insecurity. The Golden Magne title that the world celebrates as proof of natural genius? It's actually a monument to anxiety. Every skill Jungkook ever effortlessly displayed was the result of hours, days, weeks of hidden, solitary, almost compulsive practice driven by the fear of not being enough. The fear that if he wasn't the best at everything, if he showed weakness or limitation in any area, he'd lose his place. He'd be the magne who didn't deserve to be there. And he'd been carrying that fear since he was 15 years old. Jimmy, sensing the shift in energy, handled it with genuine warmth. He told Jungkook something about how that kind of drive is rare and incredible, and the audience applauded, and the moment was given the respect it deserved before the show moved on. But the internet? The internet didn't move on. Armies went into full archaeological mode, digging through years of content to trace the evidence of Jungkook's secret practice sessions. And they found it everywhere. That time Jungkook suddenly showed up with expert-level painting skills after V had been posting artwork for months. That period when Jungkook started producing his own music right after spending time watching Yoongi work in the studio. The way he taught himself to film and edit cinematic quality videos, his famous Golden Closet films, after being inspired by professional videographers on tour. None of it was spontaneous. None of it was just talent. All of it was a 20-something kid, still operating on the emotional programming of a terrified 15-year-old trainee, working himself to the bone in private to make sure the world never saw him struggle. Fan psychologists, yes, that's a real corner of the internet, started writing analyses connecting Jungkook's competitive obsession to the specific pressures of being a child in the entertainment industry. Coming to Seoul alone at such a young age, separated from his family, surrounded by hyungs who were his only support system, but also, in his mind, the standard he had to surpass. The emotional complexity of loving the people you're simultaneously terrified of disappointing. That's not a light topic. That's the kind of thing therapists build entire treatment plans around. And Jungkook had been living it, quietly, invisibly, for over a decade, all while the world called him golden and assumed everything came easy. The cruelest irony? The very thing that made him the golden magne, that relentless, almost pathological drive to master everything, was rooted not in confidence, but in its complete absence. Jimmy Fallon didn't just reveal a secret that night. He accidentally reframed an entire legend. The golden magne wasn't born. He was forged in secret, in silence, in the lonely hours between schedules, by a boy who was desperately afraid that being himself wouldn't be enough. And if you think that revelation hit hard, brace yourself, because the next member's accidentally exposed secret didn't just surprise the fans, it visibly shocked the other BTS members sitting right there on that couch, proving that even after years of living together, some truths stay buried until a late-night host with zero agenda stumbles right into them. Number 3, V, the secret art collector whose private world Jimmy unlocked on national television. Kim Taehyung. V, the face that launched 1,000 trending topics. The voice that sounds like velvet being poured into a glass of aged whiskey. The member who, for the longest time, the casual observer reduced to one devastating word, visual. Just the pretty one. The handsome one. The guy with the face. And sure, within the BTS fandom, ARMYs knew better. They knew about his soulful baritone that could shift from playful to devastating in a single breath. They knew about stigma and singularity and the way he could communicate more emotion in one sustained note than most artists manage in an entire album. They knew about his 4D personality, that beautiful, unpredictable, almost otherworldly way of experiencing the world that made him feel less like a manufactured idol and more like a character from a Ghibli film who accidentally wandered into reality. But even ARMYs, even the most dedicated, the ones who tracked every Weverse post and analyzed every behind-the-scenes clip, didn't fully understand the depth of what was happening inside Kim Taehyung's mind. Not until Jimmy Fallon, armed with nothing but friendly curiosity and a complete lack of awareness about what he was about to uncover, casually pulled a thread that unraveled one of the most carefully guarded aspects of Taehyung's private identity. And what came out wasn't just a fun celebrity factoid. It was a window into a soul that was infinitely more complex, more cultured, more quietly intellectual than the entertainment industry had ever given him credit for. Here's the moment. BTS was settled into the Tonight Show set. The energy was warm and comfortable, that classic mid-interview zone where the initial adrenaline has settled and the conversation starts flowing more naturally. Jimmy had been chatting with the members about what they do during rare days off. One of those standard interview questions that usually yields predictable answers: sleep, eat, watch movies, play games. And most of the members gave variations of exactly that. Comfortable, relatable, safe answers. But when Jimmy got to Taehyung, something different happened. Taehyung mentioned, almost as a casual aside, the way you'd mention grabbing coffee, that he likes to visit art museums. Alone. And Jimmy, intrigued because this isn't exactly the typical K-pop idol hobby, started pulling on that thread. He asked what kind of art Taehyung was into, probably expecting a surface-level answer like modern art or photography. What he got instead was a response that made the studio audience go noticeably quiet and prompted RM to turn and look at Taehyung with an expression that said even he hadn't heard all of this before. Taehyung didn't just say he liked art. He started talking about specific movements, specific artists, specific pieces, with the kind of detail and genuine passion that you simply cannot fake. He mentioned being drawn to post-impressionist works and how the emotional intensity of painters like Van Gogh resonated with something deep inside him. He talked about visiting galleries not to be seen or to post Instagram photos, but to stand in front of a single painting for 20, 30 minutes, letting it communicate with him in a language that exists beyond words. He described art as the only space where he felt completely anonymous, where Kim Taehyung and V both disappeared, and he was just a human being having a private conversation with color and form and centuries of preserved emotion hanging on a wall. Jimmy was visibly fascinated. You could see him recalibrating in real time, the way good interviewers do when they realize they've accidentally stumbled into something genuinely profound. He asked follow-up questions. And Taehyung, seemingly surprised by how much space he was being given to talk about this, because let's be honest, how often does a K-pop idol get asked about art theory on American late-night television? Kept going. He revealed that he had been quietly building a personal art collection. Not as an investment. Not as a status symbol. As a dialogue. He described each piece he'd acquired as a conversation partner, something he could come home to after the chaos of schedules and performances and live in quiet communion with. He talked about how the texture of a brushstroke on canvas made him feel grounded in a way that the digital, hyper-connected, constantly surveilled world of being a global celebrity never could. And then came the detail that truly sent the fandom into orbit. Taehyung mentioned that his interest in visual art had fundamentally shaped his approach to music. That when he was developing songs for his solo work, he didn't start with melodies or lyrics, he started with colors. He would decide the emotional palette of a song the way a painter decides the palette of a canvas. Layover wasn't just an album to him, it was a series of paintings rendered in sound. Each track had a color in his mind, a texture, a specific quality of light. Slow dancing was amber and warm, like late afternoon sun through old glass. Rainy days was gray-blue, watercolor soft, deliberately blurred at the edges. He was describing synesthesia, or something very close to it, this neurological blending of senses where sound becomes color and color becomes emotion and emotion becomes art that exists simultaneously in multiple dimensions. And he'd never talked about this publicly before. Not like this. Not with this level of specificity and vulnerability. Jimmy Fallon, God bless him, probably thought he was having a nice chat about hobbies. What he actually did was expose the fact that one of the world's most famous faces had been quietly living a parallel intellectual life that would put most fine arts graduates to shame. The aftermath was extraordinary. Armies who had always defended Taehyung against the just a visual reductionism suddenly had ammunition that went nuclear. Here was documented proof, on mainstream American television, no less, that Kim Taehyung wasn't just handsome, wasn't just talented, wasn't just charmingly eccentric. He was a genuine aesthete. A self-educated art connoisseur. A man who processed reality through frameworks that most people encounter only in university philosophy courses and then promptly forget. Music critics who had previously given Taehyung's solo work polite but shallow reviews started revisiting Layover with completely different ears. The album's deliberately sparse production, its refusal to chase trends, its almost confrontational quietness in an era of maximalist pop, it all suddenly made sense when you understood that it was created by someone who thinks in paintings, not playlists. Art World Publications picked up the story. Gallery owners in Seoul and Paris and New York started noting increased interest from young visitors who specifically mentioned Taeyong as their entry point into fine art. A K-pop idol was accidentally becoming a cultural bridge between the entertainment industry and the art world, and it happened because Jimmy Fallon asked a simple question about days off. But perhaps the most moving dimension of this revelation was what it said about Taeyong's relationship with identity. In an industry that aggressively categorizes people, the dancer, the rapper, the vocalist, the visual, Taeyong had quietly built an entire inner world that defied categorization. A world where he wasn't V from BTS. Where he wasn't the face on the billboard. Where he was simply a person standing in a gallery, feeling something real, collecting pieces of beauty to take home, and live within the silence of his own space. That's not a hobby. That's a survival mechanism for someone whose public identity has been defined by other people since he was a teenager. And Jimmy Fallon accidentally broadcast it to the entire world before Taeyong even realized how much he'd shared. The look on Taeyong's face at the end of that exchange, that quiet, almost startled smile, like he'd just realized he'd said more than he intended, will stay with anyone who caught it. It was the look of a man who keeps his deepest self locked in private galleries, and who just watched a late-night host accidentally leave the door wide open. Now, if you think an accidental art world expose is the peak of this list, you're not ready for what's coming next, because the member in the number 2 spot didn't just have a secret revealed. Jimmy pulled something out of them so unexpectedly raw that the live audience fell into a silence you could physically feel through the screen. Number 2, RM, the leader's loneliest burden that Jimmy exposed in front of the entire world. Kim Namjoon. RM, the leader, the brain. The philosopher-rapper who quotes Nietzsche in one breath and drops bars that hit like freight trains in the next. The man who taught himself English by watching Friends on repeat, who stood at the United Nations podium and told an entire generation to love themselves, who has carried 7 people's dreams on his shoulders since he was a teenager and somehow made it look like the most natural thing in the world. Namjoon is, by virtually every measurable standard, the most important single individual in the story of BTS's global conquest. Without his English fluency, BTS's crossover into Western media doesn't happen the way it did. Without his intellectual depth, BTS's music doesn't achieve the philosophical resonance that elevated them beyond typical pop. Without his leadership, 7 wildly different personalities don't survive the pressures that have destroyed countless other groups. That's the RM the world sees, composed, articulate, wise beyond his years, always saying the right thing at the right time in the right language. But what happens when the cameras are off and the translator has no one to translate his own feelings to? What does the voice of BTS sound like when it's speaking only to itself? Jimmy Fallon, in a moment of pure conversational instinct that he almost certainly didn't recognize as significant, accidentally answered those questions on live television. And the answer was devastating. The setup was deceptively ordinary. BTS was mid-interview on The Tonight Show, and Jimmy, who by this point had developed a genuine rapport with the group across multiple appearances, was in full conversational flow. The topic had drifted toward the mechanics of interviews themselves, how BTS handles doing press in English-speaking countries, the logistics of communication. It was meta, almost, talking about the process of talking. And Jimmy, with that signature curiosity that makes him such an effective interviewer precisely because it doesn't feel like interviewing, turned to Namjoon and said something along the lines of asking whether it ever feels like a lot of pressure being the one who always has to speak for everyone. Whether it's tiring being the bridge. A simple, empathetic question. The kind any decent host would ask. But the way Namjoon received it, the way his entire body language shifted, the way his eyes dropped for just a fraction of a second before his media training kicked back in told a story that words hadn't yet caught up to. Namjoon paused. And in that pause, that 2, maybe 3-second gap that felt like an eternity on live television, you could see him making a decision. The decision between the polished leader answer and the honest one. He chose honest. Namjoon admitted, with a rawness that visibly surprised even the members sitting beside him, that the translation burden wasn't just about language. It was about representation. Every time he opened his mouth in an English interview, he wasn't just converting Korean to English, he was compressing 7 people's thoughts, 7 people's emotions, 7 people's nuanced perspectives into his singular voice. And the terror, his word, terror, was that he'd get it wrong. That he'd accidentally misrepresent what Yoongi meant. That he'd fail to capture the depth of what Taehyung was trying to express. That he'd flatten Jimin's emotions or oversimplify Hoseok's intentions or miss the subtext of what Jin was really saying. Every single interview in English was, for Namjoon, an exercise in high-stakes emotional interpretation where one wrong word choice could misrepresent someone he loved to millions of people. And no one ever talked about that. Jimmy leaned in. The studio got quieter. And Namjoon kept going, as if a dam had cracked and the pressure behind it was too immense to reseal. He talked about specific moments, without naming exact interviews, where he'd lain awake at night replaying his translations, agonizing over whether he'd accurately conveyed what a member had intended to say. Moments where he'd translated a member's deeply personal sentiment and then watched the Western media reduce it to a headline that missed the point entirely and felt personally responsible for that reduction. He described this perpetual, grinding anxiety of being the bottleneck through which all of BTS's humanity had to pass in order to reach the English-speaking world. 7 full human beings, each with their own complex inner worlds, their own ways of expressing emotion, their own cultural references and linguistic nuances. All of it filtered through one 20-something guy sitting on a talk show couch trying to do justice to people he considers family while cameras roll and millions watch. The weight of that responsibility is almost incomprehensible when you actually stop and think about it. And Namjoon had been carrying it silently since 2017, when BTS first started their serious push into American media. Years. Years of being the bridge, the filter, the voice. Years of other members being able to sit back during English interviews, not out of laziness, but out of linguistic necessity, while Namjoon carried the conversational load alone. And here's the part that truly wrecked the fandom. Namjoon mentioned, almost as a parenthetical, that there were times when he wanted to express his own thoughts during interviews but couldn't, because the limited time was better spent making sure the other members' voices were heard. He would sacrifice his own airtime, his own opportunity to share his perspective, to ensure that Yoongi's answer got properly translated, or that Jungkook's shy but meaningful comment wasn't lost. The leader perpetually erasing himself to amplify others. Speaking for everyone except himself. Jimmy, and you could see it in his face, was genuinely moved. He wasn't performing empathy. He was feeling it. He told Namjoon that what he does isn't just translating, it's an act of love, and Namjoon's eyes went glassy for just a moment before he blinked it away and nodded with that tight-lipped smile he does when he's holding back something he doesn't want the world to see. But it was too late. The world had already seen it. And then came the moment that armies would screenshot, GIF, and share millions of times across every platform. Jimin, who had been sitting next to Namjoon throughout this entire exchange, quietly reached over and placed his hand on Namjoon's knee. No words. No dramatic gesture. Just a hand on a knee. A silent acknowledgement from one member to his leader that said everything language couldn't. I know. I see what you carry. I'm sorry I can't carry more of it. And the other members' faces, captured in split-screen reaction shots that fans would later isolate and analyze frame by frame, told the same story. Jin's joy tightening slightly. Yoongi looking down at his hands. Hoseok's smile fading into something more serious. Taehyung staring at Namjoon with that intense, unreadable gaze. Jungkook blinking rapidly in a way that fans recognized as his tell for suppressed emotion. They all knew. On some level, they all understood what Namjoon did for them every time they sat in an English-speaking environment. But hearing him articulate it like that, hearing the loneliness in it, the fear, the self-erasure, was different from knowing it abstractly. It made it real in a way that couldn't be unfelt. The online response was seismic. Translation communities and linguistic scholars wrote detailed analyses of the cognitive and emotional toll of being a real-time interpreter for high-stakes media appearances. Fans who spoke both Korean and English started going back through old interviews, comparing what members said in Korean to what Namjoon translated, and found that overwhelmingly, his translations weren't just accurate, they were elevated. He consistently made the other members sound more articulate, more nuanced, more profound in English than a literal translation would have. He wasn't just translating. He was advocating. Crafting the best possible version of each member's words because he understood that Western audiences were forming their impressions of his brothers based entirely on his English. He was, in essence, ghostwriting 6 people's public personas in a second language in real time under studio lights with no script and no safety net. The pressure is almost unthinkable. And Jimmy Fallon surfaced all of it with one well-meaning question that Namjoon probably wishes he'd answered with the polished leader response instead. But he didn't. He chose truth. And truth, once it's out on The Tonight Show, doesn't go back to being a secret. It becomes part of the story. Permanently. Namjoon's story, the loneliest leader in pop music, speaking for everyone, heard by millions, understood by almost no one, was now part of the public record. Thanks to a host who just wanted to know if translating was tiring. Number 1, Jimin, the confession that stopped time and left Jimmy Fallon speechless on his own show. Park Jimin. The moment you've been waiting for. The member whose name sits at the very top of this countdown for a reason that will make sense the second you hear what happened, and will haunt you long after you finish reading. Because if every other entry on this list was Jimmy Fallon accidentally bumping into a closed door and revealing what was behind it, this one was Jimmy accidentally walking into a cathedral. Something sacred. Something Jimin had been protecting with every fiber of his being for years. And the reason this sits at number 1 isn't just because of what was revealed, it's because of how Jimin revealed it. The silence. The trembling. The way an entire studio full of people collectively held their breath while one of the most celebrated performers on the planet stripped himself bare in front of millions without any warning, any preparation, any safety net. This is the moment that transcended BTS content and became something universally, achingly human. Let's go back. You need to understand who Park Jimin is, not the stage Jimin, not the Jimin of fan cams and dance compilations and viral moments, but the actual human architecture of this person, because without that context, the magnitude of what Jimmy uncovered doesn't land properly. Jimin was the last member to join BTS's trainee lineup. The very last. Every other member had already been selected, already been training together, already building the chemistry and brotherhood that would eventually conquer the world. And then, late in the process, this kid from Busan, trained in contemporary dance at Busan High School of Arts, technically brilliant but emotionally raw, was added to the group. He arrived in soul-carrying extraordinary talent, but also an extraordinary burden, the feeling of being the outsider. The latecomer. The one who had to prove that he deserved to be there while 6 other people had already established their bonds, their dynamics, their inside jokes. And from that very first day, Jimin made a decision that would define his entire existence within BTS. He decided that he would earn his place not through talent alone, but through devotion. Absolute, unconditional, almost sacrificial devotion to the group, to the members, and eventually to ARMY. If he wasn't the most naturally gifted rapper, he'd be the hardest working dancer. If he couldn't write lyrics like Namjoon, he'd pour every molecule of emotion into his vocals until his voice itself became a form of poetry. And if he ever felt like he wasn't enough, which, as we now know, was devastatingly often, he would punish himself into becoming more. More practice. More dieting. More sleepless nights in the practice room. More. Always more, because in Jimin's internal calculus, he was perpetually one mistake away from not deserving to stand beside these 6 people he loved more than anything. That's the emotional foundation. That's the fault line that had been running underneath Jimin's dazzling smile for over a decade. And Jimmy Fallon stepped right on it. The moment happened during what was supposed to be a warm, celebratory segment. BTS was riding high, a major comeback, chart-topping numbers, the world at their feet. Jimmy was in peak form, radiating that infectious enthusiasm, making the members laugh, keeping the energy buoyant. And at some point, the conversation turned to gratitude. Jimmy asked the members, in a general, feel-good kind of way, what they were most grateful for in their journey. Standard late-night fare. The kind of question designed to elicit heartwarming sound bites that play well in clips. Most of the members gave beautiful, genuine answers about ARMY, about music, about each other. And then Jimmy turned to Jimin. And Jimin started to answer, and then stopped. Not a dramatic pause. Not a theatrical beat for effect. He physically stopped because something caught in his throat. His eyes, those famously expressive, impossibly emotive eyes, went liquid. And the words that eventually came out, haltingly, with a vulnerability so raw it felt almost invasive to witness, rewrote everything the public thought they understood about Park Jimin. Jimin said, and his voice was barely above a whisper, the studio so quiet you could hear the ambient hum of the equipment, that what he was most grateful for was that the members never gave up on him during the times he wanted to give up on himself. He said there were periods, real periods, not hypothetical, not exaggerated for dramatic effect, where he genuinely believed he wasn't good enough to be in BTS. Where he would watch the other members, watch Namjoon's intellect, Youngi's genius, Hoseok's precision, Jin's resilience, Taeyoung's artistry, Jungkook's limitless ability, and feel not inspired but crushed. Crushed by the comparison. Crushed by the distance between who he was and who he thought he needed to be. And during those periods, he said, he would isolate himself. Stay behind in the practice room long after everyone else had gone to sleep. Dance the same routine over and over until his body was screaming, but his mind was still whispering that it wasn't enough. Skip meals because he believed the exhaustion and hunger were somehow the price he needed to pay for the privilege of being in this group. And the members, Jimin's voice cracked here, and the sound of it cut through the studio like a blade. The members would come find him. Every time. No matter how late. No matter how many times he'd told them to go ahead without him. They'd come to the practice room, and they wouldn't lecture him, wouldn't try to fix him with words. They'd just sit with him. Sometimes they'd bring food and quietly place it beside him. Sometimes they'd just be there, present, a physical reminder that he wasn't alone even when his mind was telling him he was. Youngie, Jimin said, once sat on the practice room floor at 4 a.m. without saying a single word for 45 minutes, just so Jimin wouldn't be alone with his thoughts. Just sat there, scrolling through his phone, existing in the same space, radiating a silent message. I'm not leaving. You can practice until your legs give out, but I'm not leaving this room without you. Jimmy Fallon was motionless. The audience was motionless. The other members were in various states of emotional unraveling. Hoseok had his head down. Jin was blinking hard at the ceiling. Jungkook had turned his entire body away from the camera in a way that ARMYs immediately recognized as his response to overwhelming emotion. So there it is. 7 moments. 7 members. 7 secrets that were never supposed to see the light of a studio lamp, but found their way into the world because one late-night host has the rare gift of making people forget they're on television. But let's step back from the individual revelations and look at what this list, taken as a whole, actually tells us, because there's a thread connecting all 7 of these moments that's bigger than any single member. At number 7, Jin showed us that the funniest person in the room is often the one processing the most in silence, cooking alone at 3 a.m. while the world sleeps, turning food into therapy and solitude into survival. At number 6, Suga revealed that genius isn't a gift, it's an obsession. A man who literally cannot stop creating, who chases melodies into his dreams and wakes up reaching for his phone because the music inside him doesn't respect the boundary between consciousness and sleep. At number 5, J-Hope shattered the illusion that happiness is effortless, showing us that being the sun for others is a daily choice that comes with a cost, and that choosing to shine even when you're running on empty is perhaps the most profound form of love there is. At number 4, Jungkook dismantled the myth of the natural prodigy, revealing that the golden magne was forged in secret practice sessions fueled not by confidence, but by a 15-year-old's terror of not being enough for the people he looked up to most. At number 3, V unveiled an entire inner world of art, aesthetics, and philosophical depth that the entertainment industry had never bothered to look for behind his famous face, proving that the quietest minds often contain the richest universes. At number 2, RM exposed the loneliest job in pop music, speaking for 7 people in a language that isn't his own, perpetually erasing himself so others could be heard, carrying the weight of representation with a grace that masked how heavy it truly was. And at number 1, Jimin broke every wall down and showed us the raw, unvarnished truth that the heart of BTS, the member whose devotion holds the group together, spent years believing he didn't deserve to be there at all. And was saved, over and over, not by applause or awards, but by a Hyung sitting on a practice room floor at 4 a.m., silently saying, "I'm not leaving." And maybe that's the real secret Jimmy Fallon revealed, not about any individual member, but about BTS as a whole. That the thing that makes them extraordinary isn't the music, the choreography, the records, or the sold-out stadiums. It's this: the willingness to be human in an industry that rewards machines. The courage to feel in a system designed to produce. The stubborn, defiant, breathtaking insistence on being real, even when real is messy, painful, and terrifying. That's not a group. That's a family. And Jimmy Fallon had the accidental privilege of proving it to the world. Thanks for sticking with us through all 7 entries. If this list made you feel something, if it made you see a member differently, understand a struggle more deeply, or just appreciate the humans behind the phenomenon, then it did exactly what it was supposed to do. Until next time.